Hi, I'm Elena. Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to share a video of 10 classics under 300 pages that are accessible for beginners. When I started reading classics, I definitely had a hard time finding the classics that I thought would be accessible for me, that would be easy for me to read, easy for me to get into, and most of all, really enjoy. Over these last few years, I've been getting more into classics. I've been able to challenge myself more, but of course sometimes I find another classic that I find surprisingly accessible. I will measure this by, of course, the length of the book, so all of these books are under 300 pages, but I also look at the writing, whether or not the writing is accessible, or if it maybe translates very well to a modern time, in the sense that it looks quite a lot like the way authors write these days. The goal of this video is to help you find a few books that are easy for you to get into, that help you get into classics, and that you will probably, hopefully, enjoy. I've tried to find a few books that have different genres and different themes. When you start reading classics, it's quite important to look at your already existing reading taste and try to translate that into classic literature. So maybe you like dystopian and sci-fi, maybe you like romance, maybe you like historical fiction, maybe you really appreciate it when books really talk a lot about different social issues. All of those books I have right here, and hopefully you can find a book that you like. So to start off, if you are someone who really likes to read gothic books, I would recommend Carmilla. Carmilla is a very early sapphic vampire story that was written before Dracula. This is a very thin book. I believe I listened to the audiobook that was only 5 hours long, and it is set up in a very detective-like way. We follow a girl who lives in a big castle, and one day a very mysterious visitor comes to the castle who turns out to be a female vampire, and they build a certain relationship and they have a certain attraction towards each other. You can read this in different kind of ways. I think the whole sapphic social structure doesn't translate incredibly well to modern times, but it's still really interesting to read one of the earlier vampire stories, and the writing is definitely very accessible. If you like to read dystopian and sci-fi, I'm sure you've heard of George Orwell. Most people often mention 1984, which is a book that I've read, didn't really love. One that I think has very accessible writing is Animal Farm, and Animal Farm is also a very political novel, so very political dystopian. If that is your jam, I think you will enjoy Animal Farm. Animal Farm is about a farm of animals who at some point decided they don't like the way they are treated. They're able to converse and to start a political party, but very soon this political party that has very good intentions starts to get corrupt. George Orwell made a lot of parallels with the Soviet Union. The book is very easy to read, which was also Orwell's intention, and this is definitely one I really enjoyed, even though the general dystopian genre is not for me. I think Animal Farm is very accessible and very enjoyable. Over here I have 3 books that have a bit more of a political tone, that are more about society, but all of them I feel are written very accessibly, and again they're short. So we have Their Eyes Are Watching Gold by Zora Neale Hurston. This is historical fiction about a young girl who grows up with her grandmother, and she is very early on told by her grandmother that men are dangerous, and that as soon as you come in contact with men, you have to secure your place or they will take advantage of you. But our main character, even though she has been warned by her grandmother that men are like this, she wants love, she wants all the adventures and romance of life, even though that is not something that is generally granted to a woman in her position. I thought this was a very gorgeous, beautiful book with some heartbreaking parts as well. The themes in this book feel very accessible because a lot of authors still really write about these kinds of themes, still really write about these kind of settings. So if this sounds like something you'll enjoy, I would highly recommend it. The other novel is set after the First World War and is a lot about war and trauma and mental health. This is The Return of the Soldier by Rebecca West. I was really impressed by the way that Rebecca West wrote this, because we follow 3 women and one man they have somehow in common. Goes to war, and when he comes back he is traumatized in a way that he cannot remember the last 15 years of his life, and all these 3 women have a certain relation to him. To all of them this has a different effect. Even though this novel is really short, the main priority of the novel is to understand the effect on these women, because we get to hear the story from the perspective of one of the women, but also to help understand what mental health in war is like. Another book I think has been going around quite a lot, so you will probably know it already. There's also been a Netflix adaptation of it, and that is Passing by Nella Larsen. This follows the friendship between 2 light-skinned women who grew up together, and one of them has decided to live an adult life within the black community and the other within the white community, and when they're grown up they meet again. Their friendship still feels quite strong, but the different choices that they have made have big consequences in the way that they live their life right now. Especially the woman who has denied a big side of her by lying to her husband of her heritage. She really feels drawn again to the black community, and that raises a lot of conflict between these two women. This is not accessible, I think, in a way that you can really understand very well what's going on, because there's, I think, a lot of vagueness within this book, but again, I think within themes and how authors write these days. If you read a lot of contemporary novels, especially if you like literary fiction a little bit, then I think you will be able to get on board with the writing and the way that the plot is revealed. I have two books that are a little bit darker, that have a bit of romance, that have a little bit of politics, but that I think if you really like the dark academia kind of books, if you like the dark academia kind of atmosphere, I think you will appreciate these two books. The first book is Maurice by Ian Forster. Ian Forster is of course very well known for writing A Room with a View and Howard's End. Both of these books I would recommend, but those books are books that I've recommended before, so I wanted to recommend another one. Maurice was a very personal book for Ian Forster because he wrote it very early in his career, but it was only published after his death because it describes his experience of being gay in the early 20th century. We follow Maurice, who falls in love with a man he meets at his university, and their difficult relationship with their own bodies, their own physicality, and of course eventually Maurice with his own sexuality. There are content warnings in this book for homophobia and how homosexuality was treated as a mental illness, but of course it is written from a personal and critical perspective of a gay man. This is one of the earlier queer novels, and if that is a theme you really are very passionate to read about, this definitely needs to be on your list. Ian Forster's writing is generally very accessible, so any of his novels I think will do if you want to start out reading classics, but this is one I wanted to recommend in this video. If you want to get into Russian literature, which I have read a little bit of Russian literature, not a whole lot, it's not my main priority. Books like Anna Karenina and The Master and Margarita I read very early on, which might not be something I would recommend because they're quite big investments. Another author I've been reading more of is Anton Chekov. I really enjoy Anton Chekov. I think his writing is incredibly good and surprisingly accessible. I'm sure it also matters with the translations, but I think his short stories are amazing and a great place to start. This is one of the collections that I've read and it's called Gooseberries. It has multiple stories, romance, war, politics. I think everything that you kind of expect from Russian literature you can find in here, but in a very short and accessible format. I read this over a year ago, and one short story that really still sticks with me is about a man who is in the army, but he definitely does not want to be there. And it's about his mental journey in trying to find distance between him and the work that he does. And I found it incredibly impressive, and it was so easy to read. I have 3 more books, and these have romance as a main theme. Keeping within the Russian literature, I want to recommend First Love by Ivan Turgenev. This again is a very short and very accessible Russian classic. This one is very easy to read, has a very easy plot, a very engaging plot overall. What I like most about this book is that it has a lot of very interesting twists and turns very early on in the novel, so you are gripped right away, and this is a book that you can read in a very fast succession. We meet a young boy who is in his late teens in the beginning of the novel. He and his family get new neighbors, and one of the new neighbors is a woman that he falls in love with. Later on in his life he has a conversation with friends, and they all tell their story of their first love, and he tells the story of that woman, which is quite a story. Again, the writing is incredibly accessible in this novel, and it has a very engaging plot. One of the most beautiful books on this list that I read quite recently is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. In Giovanni's Room we follow a man called David who has gone to Paris with his girlfriend. They have some issues to work out, so his girlfriend decides to go to Spain whilst he stays in Paris, and he meets Giovanni. They develop a romantic relationship that mainly plays out in Giovanni's small Paris room. David's sexuality is a very difficult topic for him. It's something that he struggles with a lot. It's something that he doesn't want to talk about. It's something that he doesn't want to acknowledge, but of course in James Baldwin's his amazing writing, everything comes together in a way. This book has quite lyrical writing and does demand that you are quite an attentive reader while you're reading it. The themes and the characters feel very modern, and they're very easy to understand from a modern perspective. This was written in the 1950s twenties, so therefore it's also a bit accessible, but I feel sometimes characters in classics are described in a way that really asks a lot of imagination and understanding of the time for us. In this book, the characters are really quite easy to understand, and I think it's very easy to relate to them. The last book I want to recommend is Eat or Frome by Edith Wharton. This is in a way a bit of a retelling of Wuthering Heights, but very in its own take. We follow a young farmer who marries an older woman that he grows to resent, and when her niece comes to visit to their farm, he falls in love with the niece. This is a very quiet book from the perspective of the man that we meet and of him coming to terms with his emotions. There are a few plot twists in this book that make it very interesting and really food for thought. This again is written very easily, it's very easy to follow. The plot feels very familiar when you're reading it, and it doesn't take a lot out of the reader to follow this book. So this is definitely an accessible classic because of the writing, not necessarily because of the characters, and it is one that I truly enjoyed. Those are the 10 classics that I would recommend if you want to get into classics. If you feel like you are a beginner when it comes to reading classics, there are a lot of beautiful, amazing books out there, and if I've interested you to read any of these books, then please let me know. I would love to know which one you would like to read. I can definitely say that I enjoyed each and every one of these books. If you would like more recommendations like this, then I would love it if you would subscribe, and I hope to see you in another video. Doei!